where we were living in Ojai, game warden was 2 houses up, and died of the wool trout fisherman. And he came by one evening, he says, I was up in Matilaha Canyon, and there's a young condor sitting in the tree there, and it just stayed there all the time I was fishing. Never saw any adults come in. So Borneman and I went up the next day, you know, ha, 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 you know, this guy probably didn't know, it's probably a red-tailed hawk or something. Well, we got up there, it was a young condor, it was sitting in the tree. And I don't remember if we watched it for 1 day or 2 days, but there were no adults coming in to feed it. And you know, there were phone calls back and forth, and the Condor Advisory Committee said, you need to go and catch it. You need to bring it into captivity. It's just going to starve to death out there. So John Borneman and I went out. You know, there was no problem. We had a big landing net. And this bird was obviously very weak and starved. And, you know, we'd just climb up in the tree and grab it. So we climbed up in the tree, and as soon as it saw us, it took off and glided down the canyon. And, you know, we said, well, no problem. It can't fly. It's just gliding. It's going to get lower and lower, and eventually it's going to hit the ground. And, you know, going down canyon, it doesn't go down as fast as if it were gliding up canyon. But so it was in another tree, a much lower tree, and we went down. And again, it took off and went down canyon. We said, we're making progress. It's down in the shrubbery now, you know. And we went down, and as soon as we got to the shrubbery, it took off and flew and circled up and landed on the hillside. Well, now it was in this dense chaparral, you know, 10, 15 feet high. And so, you know, what do we do? Well, finally, we got a Forest Service guy up there, and he and I went up the slope, and John Borneman would stand on the road on the opposite side of the canyon. And when we could find a place where we could look out through the chaparral, he would wave a handkerchief, and it's, you know, it's to your right, or it's higher, or, you know, just indicating. And then we would creep up until we could look up through the chaparral and see the bird's feet. And this went on and on. And we went home for the night, and we came back the next day, and we chased that thing, you know, from one perch to another. And at one point, John Lorenzano, who was the Forest Service guy with me, we'd gone up this little gut, and we knew the bird was on our right, and there was this huge wall of poison oak, you know, 10 feet high or so on the wall. So we took our machetes and chopped through that, and somehow coming from poison ivy country to poison oak country, I developed an immunity, so the stuff didn't bother me. John Lorenzano was very sensitive, and for some reason, after 20 years of work with the Forest Service, didn't identify the poison oak. He was just slashing away. So he spent a week in the hospital afterwards recovering. But anyway, we got up through this and got up, and there was the silly bird sitting on the ground. First time we'd found it when it wasn't in a tree. And we just ran and leaped. It was a little bit lower, and we just leaped out, and as it spread its wings, we landed right on top of it, you know, and got it all wrapped up and stuffed it in the bag and took it back down to the road. And a young high school couple was driving by, and you know, this duffel bag is going womp, 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 womp. And the guy says, what do you have, you know? And Borneman says, antlion, got an antlion. And the guy says, oh, yeah, okay. But anyway, then we took it back to our garage and fed it 3 pounds of hamburger. I held out a dish of hamburger, and it just hit my hand. You know, it was going to tear the hell out of me. And as soon as it tasted that hamburger, it just, and it vanished. Then we took it down to the LA Zoo the next day, and it spent quite a long time there. It was down to 17 pounds, and they nursed it back to 20-something. But it was in cages, and there was debate back and forth, and again, all of these phone calls. And you don't want to keep it in captivity. That's awful. You're not supposed to put these birds in captivity. And they consulted Carl Koford, and he said, I had a king vulture once that dropped out of the nest, and I took it back and put it on a garbage dump, and the parents found it, and you know. So we decided we would put a deer carcass out on the high ridges above the canyon where we'd found it, stake the bird out there, and then watch it until the parents came and, you know, accepted it back into their good graces. So we went up there and we drove this stake into the ground, and we put a noose around the leg and back to the stake. And we sat there, and you know, I would watch one day, and John Borneman would watch another, and then the Forest Service guy would come up. And about the fourth day, we got this frantic phone call from the Forest Service guy. He had been watching it. It had snowed. Everything was wet and muddy and stuff. And finally, 2 condors had come in, and they'd sat on the carcass and started feeding. And then one of the condors pushed, you know, wanted the whole carcass to itself, or an eagle came in or something. But anyway, the condor came off, and he took one look at that young condor and decided he was going to kick the shit out of this little bird. He was going to. So he did. He went right at him, just mauling him, you know. And of course, the young bird panicked, and with the snow and the melting snow, the stake had loosened up, and he took off, trailing this fairly large wooden stake behind him, and went out over the chaparral out of sight to Lorenzano. And Lorenzano had raced down and around the other side of this little mound and couldn't find any evidence of the bird. So Borneman and I went up, and we looked, and the next day or the day after, we got a small airplane, and we flew just over the top of the chaparral all around the area. Couldn't find, you know, figured we'd see the stake lying on top of or the bird perched there, and we didn't find anything. And so then everybody again was in a panic. We had lined up about 50 Fish and Game people in California, Department of Game people, and they were all going to come down the next day and line up, and then we were going to walk the chaparral shoulder to shoulder until we found this damn thing, which was now dead, of course. So Lorenzano and I were up there walking out the first 50 yards maybe, so we could start these lines of people a reasonable distance away from the release point. And Lorenzano says, God, you know, every time I walk the fire break through here, I smell this rotten smell. And I had a bad cold, and I said, Lorenzano, I think we found it. And we look out, and there's the stake, just in plain, you know, how we could miss it, how you miss these things. We raced down under the chaparral, and you can figure some idea of the height. The bird was dangling head first from the tie to the stake, and then he was at about eye level when you came in underneath with his head there. So we raced over to him, and immediately he bit me right on the arm, you know. So that was wonderful. He was alive. We got him off. We took him down, took him to the zoo, threw him in the cage, and he couldn't walk. He just lay there on his side, you know. He'd get up, and then he'd fall over on the leg that had been stretched for the 5 days hanging in the brush. And then he got up on his tiptoes and stretched, and, you know, stretched his leg out, and after that he was fine. And then the thinking was, hey, 2 years before, there had been a bird poisoned with strychnine. They had brought it into the zoo and nursed it back to health and taken it back out. 2 or 3 years before that, there'd been another bird that had come in and been nursed back to health. These things come in all the time. We're not going to release birds anymore. We're going to start captive breeding. Topa Topa is going to be the first member, and as soon as we get a mate for him, you know, we're going to go. And in the course of 10 years, we'd expect to have at least 2 or 3 other birds in there. Be sure to have one of the opposite sex. Well, it never happened. The next 20 years, 30 years, there were no other birds were brought in to be rehabbed until they started catching birds from the wild and bringing eggs in and hatching them. So best laid plans. But anyway, Topa Topa was fun because we would go in each month and catch him, spread out the wing, and photograph the wing because we wanted to study the development of the color pattern under the wing and also to follow the wing molt. So we got good data from that until Topa decided that he was not going to do this anymore. But inevitably, when you came in, he would go for your pant leg. He could just see the seam, and as soon as you relaxed your attention, his beak would be right in there, and he would have ripped the pant leg all the way down. He did this to every visitor who came in. He was really, and one of the most wonderful stories I remember, carry in my memory, a substitute keeper came in one weekend because the regular keeper, taking his Saturday off. And this guy came in, he was a little apprehensive about the bird, and in its flight cage it had a 5-foot high ledge where it sat. And then you threw the the food, which was normally day-old chicks down on the ground, and he would come down and gobble them up. So the keeper comes in, and Topa Topa's up on the shelf, and he jumps down, and the keeper's terrified, the substitute keeper's terrified, backs up and hits the log on the ground, which Topa Topa normally sat on, goes flat on his ass over there. Topa hits the ground and sees the guy going down, comes up and lands right on his chest with both feet, and just looks in his face, like that. So, this guy, that was it. He was never going in the cage again. You can fire me, you can whatever, I'll go shovel elephant dung for the rest of my life before I'll go back in there. Well, after 2 months, the 2 regular keepers said, look, we go in every single day. Topa's fine. There's no problem. Come in with us. We'll protect you. So they go in, one guy on each side of the substitute keeper. Topa comes down off the perch, up, hits the guy full in the chest with both feet, knocks him flat on his ass. I mean, obviously he identified this guy. He says, this guy's a sucker. I'm going to put him down again, Because he never did that to anybody else, but this guy he knew, and he came up and just hit him full force, and 20-some pounds of bird hitting you.
And how old was Topa Topa when you guys brought him in?
Well, he had to be just that year's hatch.
Okay,
I mean, I assume he had just fledged from the nest, and for some reason been abandoned by the adults, And maybe the adults, were lost or something. Maybe he was an orphan. But it's strange. We theorized at the time, hey, he got way down in the canyon and the adults can't get down in there or don't want to come down in there. But that seems a little strange because after that we saw birds in similar situations that got in and out. But that was the thing at the time, that the bird had gotten into an area where it couldn't get out and the adults couldn't get in to feed it. And they certainly didn't come in and feed it. So.